So yeah, here we are. Sega took the add-on joke a little bit too far. With the Sega CD, maybe you got a few chuckles from die-hard Sega fans, but when they announced the 32X, if this thing was a joke, its timing was really flat. What we got was an add-on that bridged the gap between 16 and 32 bits, propelling the Mega Drive somewhere between the Super Nintendo and the Atari Jaguar. So was it a good place for Sega to sit? Well, probably not. But it did give us a really good look at what was on the horizon with the Sega Saturn. The two big titles that Sega dropped for their unfortunate add-on were Virtua Fighter and Virtua Racing, both games that we saw in the early days of the Sega Saturn. So it turns out the 32X is really hard to justify picking up, just because so many titles for it were actually made better on the Sega Saturn, or pick up the Mega Drive version without suffering too much of a downgrade. Take Primal Rage, an arcade game that was downgraded and ported across to both the Mega Drive and the 32X, as well as a bunch of other systems including the Sega Saturn. But it was a game I was interested in picking up for the 32X, until I got to compare them. It's just a classic case of not enough improvement over the Mega Drive, and it was just done better on the Sega Saturn. The 32X got this awkward middle child between the Mega Drive and the Sega Saturn, and all things considered, it's probably one of the more expensive ways to play Primal Rage, outside the Atari Jaguar CD. So I've only got a handful of games for the 32X. The truth is, my pocket money just doesn't stretch that far, but I've got more games than the Sega CD. Metalhead, Doom, Cosmic Carnage, Star Wars Arcade, and Knuckles Chaotix. Yeah, not many games, but a pretty good cross-section of titles that are available for the system. When I pick up a hardcore games machine, and I'm not talking about a well-utilised, well-thought-out, particularly well-remembered games machine, but a hardcore games machine that brought 32 bits to the mainstream market, you want a few titles that can get it hot under the hood. Games that show off what was in store for people moving into 32 bits. And that's where Metalhead comes in for me. A pretty common, totally shallow mech game. This thing really feels like the type of game that would have been an awesome tech demo, but they fleshed it out and made it a game, and that's cool. The worst part about it now is that there really aren't many games on the 32X, so Metalhead takes some pretty heavy fire without backup. It's the kind of game that if they made a Metalhead 2 with some interactive scenery and more mission variety, I feel this game might have been forgiven as an early proof of concept next to its big brother. It was only around for a year before being discontinued, and in Europe at least, this meant that there were about 8 months between the 32X and the Sega Saturn, and only around 6 months for the US. The 32X pretty much meant that Sega had hardware for the holiday season, but it wasn't going to be a stayer. Still, Metalhead is easy to pick up and play, really worth checking out just to see what the system can do. Don't pay too much for it, and don't expect to be hanging around for much long after. The main reason the PC crowd had ultimate bragging rights in the early 90s. Doom. Unfortunately, this version doesn't really give 32X owners any bragging rights of its own. It's Doom. Doom is a great game, but this version doesn't add anything special to the series, and the only way to get this game onto the 32X was by removing animation, resolutions, enemies, and levels. Despite the cuts, I think it's a great way to show off what the 32X is capable of. The 32X obviously has its limitations, but out of both the CD and the 32X, this is the one that had me really intrigued. The 32X just feels like a much more direct upgrade. Poorly handled, mistimed and ugly, but with games like Doom and Metalhead, you could really see the potential for the 32X. The 32X really didn't have too many titles for it, and in an effort to get more titles up there on the store shelves, filler titles like Cosmic Carnage came in. It showed off a little bit what the system could do, but up against games like Primal Rage, Mortal Kombat 2 and Virtua Fighter, Cosmic Carnage starts to feel a bit unnecessary. One thing going for this game is the fact it's the only exclusive fighter for the system. Games like Virtua Fighter and Primal Rage fared better on the Sega Saturn. Mortal Kombat games certainly get around, but Cosmic Carnage? Suppose the 32X is the best place for it to hang out and not cause too much damage. I wonder if that's why the Atari Jaguar has so many unique titles too. Some of the moves do aim to show off the scaling and the rotation hardware capability. And maybe the screenshots look great printed in magazines and on the back of the box. But don't expect any outlasting, novel experience here. It literally commits one of the biggest 2D fighter fouls. The frame rate varies, really badly. So let's bring it back to 3D for Star Wars Arcade. I have to admit I kinda love this transition phase between 2D and 3D titles. These polygons are big, in your face, but they look really clear cut and crisp. Full 360 movement, asteroids, spaceships, and it's a really playable, fun space shooter straight from the arcades. One thing I can totally appreciate for the 32X, they actually managed to get some pretty big names on it. Star Wars and Star Trek, but they also got their own super expensive Spider-Man game, Web of Fire. Both games I am not going to cover here, because my own mother said, if you can't say anything nice at all, then bugger off and get Ben. But the 32X is actually pretty well known for its space shooters. Obviously Star Wars Arcade is a great place to start, but Shadow Squadron is another fantastic spin on the genre. And the fact it's on rails means you can just dive straight in. Finally, there's Darkside, a PAL-only release, and if you want the original, it's one of the most expensive 32X games out there. But probably one of the single most graphically impressive titles in the 32X library. So I want to round out my 32X collection with a personal favourite, and pretty much the only reason I could justify picking up a 32X at all. Knuckles Chaotix. Love it or hate it, I am not going to spend too much time talking about the gameplay here. That could be a whole different episode, but it doesn't detract from the fact that we've got a mostly solid 2D platformer with a fresh approach to the Sonic universe. Some new characters, some old ones, same old story, and as one of the better known 32X exclusives. I can understand that those poor souls who took a chance on a crazy idea and were promised a kick-ass Sonic game probably felt a bit bummed out. This doesn't exactly play like any Sonic game, but when it's working, it's a whole lot of fun. We got a great balance between 2D stages, 3D special stages, and some small gameplay flourishes that show off a bit of that 32X power without relying on it or using it solely as a gimmick. I'll round out now by saying there were a few titles that made use of the awesome power of the 32X and the massive storage capabilities of the Sega CD. I'm not going to say they're worth the price of admission, they're just FMV games. If FMV games is something you're really passionate about, look for them elsewhere. These games look better with the 32X attached, but they're still not going to blow your mind. The Sega 32X probably didn't impress too many people at the time. How could it? A lot was promised from this little machine, and it was pretty much a stopgap measure that lasted a whole year before it was phased out completely. But just like with systems like the Atari Jaguar, it's a lot easier to look back and appreciate what we got here. Do your research, know what you're getting into, and for about 90% of you out there, you definitely will not lose any sleep about missing out on the 32X. For me personally, it's a premium bit of leftover culture, right out of Sega HQ. And you know what? For all the Super Nintendo fanboys out there, I feel sorry for you. You never got to see your system reach its peak like the Sega Mega Drive did. Thanks for tuning in, and of course, I am dead serious every time I make fun of the Nintendo in my Sega CD and 32X reviews. Thanks for watching.